Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Janet Forrest. I'm one of the adult program coordinators at the Nantucket Atheneum. And welcome to the first Yummy Monday of the 21-22 season. And I'm very excited because we're actually bringing back someone who was here at the beginning of the Yummy Mondays last year, one of the first presenters, and that's Chef Ganim Jacob. And tonight he's going to be talking about making nightmare soup. So without any further ado, I will turn my spotlight off and I will spotlight Ganim, and you can get off and running.
Hi there, thanks for joining us. Tonight, I'm gonna prepare something for you that I call nightmare soup. It's an idea that came to me, silly enough. I was listening to a stand-up comedian who was talking about his love for the Vietnamese soup pho. And he says the phrase, fish nightmares. And it just got me kind of thinking about what would a nightmare in a bowl look like or entail. So this is just kind of something that, as corny as it may sound, just kind of came together the way someone's consciousness puts a nightmare together, which is little kind of corners of things from your past, maybe you've forgotten about, but come together and become something hopefully entertaining and not frightening. So first we'll start with a shellfish broth. So it'll be some crustaceans and mollusks. I've got some head-on shrimp, some clams and some oysters, and a lobster. So I think the first thing to do would be to steam off this lobster. I'm sure people have cooked lobsters before, and I'm just going to present as if maybe you haven't. So this, I'm sure you'll recognize as a lobster. In the pot it goes. Water at a rolling boil, about an inch of water in there, and we'll let it steam for a good 5 minutes or more. It doesn't have to be fully cooked. We just need it to be cooked enough to get it out of the shell to use the meat. I've also got these shrimp, as I mentioned, head-on shrimp, so they have to be peeled and deveined. I've done most of them already. Maybe I should do this where you can see. Second floor kitchen coming up. So, of course, remove the head. A long, narrow knife is helpful. They do make something called a shrimp deveiner, which peels and deveins the shrimp in one go, allegedly. I've never used one. But if you just take a sharp knife and push it down, blade side up, sharp side up, push the point toward the tail, keeping your fingers out of the way. The blade will go through the shell, at which point you can extract the tail of the shrimp, which is most of the shrimp. And for this dish, sorry, this doesn't appear to have anything in the vein, so I think we're good there. And for this dish, I'm going to split it lengthwise because I really like what happens to shrimp, what happens to the shape of a shrimp when you split it before cooking. It gets this wild spiral kind of shape to it.
I'm sure if you have questions, Ganim would be happy to answer. So we're a small group. Don't be afraid to jump in and ask a question, right?
Absolutely. Of course. Right, down we go. Now here I've got a hot pot. And I have some fat from a jamon, a Spanish jamon that we use on a buffet at my employer's home. And of course, hamon is like a prosciutto. It has a lot of fat on the outside. It's cured. It's a little bit salty, and the fat, like the meat, has a very distinct taste. So there was so much fat left over. I thought, let's save it too. I can do it. I rendered it into liquid fat, which is solidified in my fridge. And I'm going to use it just the way a person might use butter. So a little chunk in the pot. It's a hot pot. So shells and heads. And we're just going to keep a medium-high heat. And every few, maybe 30 seconds or so, we'll give it a stir. And the reason for doing this is to essentially toast the shells of the shrimp. And that will intensify the reddish, pinkish, orange color in the shell. And then that will transfer into the water when we turn it into a broth. Over here I have some shallots that I just peeled, and I'm just going to rough chop. And a big knob of garlic that I'm just going to smash. If I had some ginger, I would probably put that in as well for this dish, because it'll marry well with the other flavors that are in the dish. As you saute the shells, you may notice that a sort of residue forms in the bottom of the pan, and that's, for us, that's a good thing. When people make gumbo, that's something that's essential to the dish. It winds up having a thick layer of not quite burnt, but this kind of sludgy residue that coats the bottom of the pan. And when you add your liquid, you pull that residue back off the pan and it disintegrates into the liquid, thus flavoring the broth. I did not look at the clock when I put in the lobster, but I think we're pretty close. Here I've got an ice bath. To shock the lobster so it stops cooking and becomes cool enough to work with. Put that to the side for a minute. It's really steamy. Now, the bits and bobs that we discussed, that I discussed. So I have, from all of the times I made shrimp over the summer, I saved the shells in baggies in the freezer. And that's going to make a very rich, very strong shrimp stock. One thing about cooking with high heat is you set off your fire alarm.
This is not the first time this has happened.
Okay. So again, constantly stirring. I poached some clams yesterday, and I have the shells. Those go in. I also apologies for the noise. Oysters.
Ganim, do you want to take a minute and shut that off, or it'll go off? Oh, there it goes.
It should go off automatically, and unfortunately, it's about 15 feet high. Sometimes steam will set it off.
Someone just had a question about what just went in the stock pot.
In the little pot, I put in, these are all little baggies of shrimp shells from all the times I made shrimp this summer. Then I had a baggie of clam shells from clams that I poached yesterday.
Okay.
Let me run downstairs and see if I can.
Okay.
3 steps was all it took. Okay, back to the oysters. These are not cooperating as I had hoped, but here we go. I'm using a homemade oyster knife, so the danger level is a bit high. There she goes. Okay, so I'm gonna drain the oyster liquor into the stock and the meat. I'm gonna go on a paper towel on this dish. I'll show you one for now. Okay. At this point, the steaming liquid from the lobster is what I use as the water. Poach the, to make the broth. And I would also put the shells of the lobster in there as well, and the oyster shells. But through the magic of Zoom, I've already got a broth ready, so that we don't have to wait 2 hours. This will take, get it all together, bring it to a simmer, and let it go for about 2 hours. And you've got a nice rich broth. I would also add these shallots and garlic. And I would add them after I've added the liquid, which isn't always how it's done, but I do that so there's no extra caramelization. When you caramelize shallots or garlic, they tend to get sort of a meaty flavor, whereas if you just boil them or simmer them, they have a more delicate and sweet flavor, which is what I prefer for this dish anyway.
Ganim, does it make any difference if you use shells that were cooked and shells that weren't? Like if you peeled the shrimp first and froze them and used them?
Okay, peeling the shrimp before cooking the shrimp and then using those shells, I think has a little more flavor than if you cook the shrimp, then peel them and use those shells. But there will still be flavor in the cooked shells. Was that the question?
Yeah, because the clams you cooked presumably before you took them out of the shell, right?
Correct. Yeah, and you wouldn't necessarily have to, but because again, it's things left over from the kitchen, to be honest. So more water for those shells. And this will just go and go. We won't worry too much about that. Lobster. Not everybody has extracted the meat from a lobster before plating. We'll show you a couple quick things I learned by doing several of these per day for a few years. And that is, first separate the tail and the claws. And I like to give it a little rinse back in the ice water. And taking the claw and pressing down, sort of overextending the elbow. Little lobster tennis elbow. And you've got knuckles, claws, tail. And when I cut through this tail, you'll see that it's only about 75% cooked, which is just fine for this dish. One hell of a mess. Also need the broth. So I have the final soup will have shrimp. These are scallops, which I've torn apart to a size that will cook very quickly in hot water. I've got some squid, the tube that I've sliced. Of course, the tentacles. Sometimes when you get squid, there's inside the tube, there's something that looks and feels like plastic, like a piece of plastic packaging, which it's not. It's just clear cartilage, which you should remove before you slice it because it will not have a good texture in your mouth. It also has these little wings, and I like to rip those off before slicing. They might be a little bit tougher than the rest of the tube. The way that the chain on a scallop is tougher than the rest of the scallop. It's not inedible, it's not bad, it's just tougher, not a nice texture. So just like the scallop, you remove the chain and remove the wings from the calamari, this squid, and I've saved them, and those go right in the broth as well. Now this lobster, this is a very wet exercise, hence the apron. I don't usually wear them, but this will get messy. So, lobster tail, try to lay it flat on the cutting board, and I like to use paper towels so it doesn't get too splattery. And often I'll put the cutting board in the bottom of my sink and do it in there because it does tend to get some distance with the splatter. So just right down the middle, you can go through the bottom or through the top. I like to go through the top. It seems to compress the meat less, but it does take some confidence with the knife. Like this would open. The claws, if you pull the thumb, I call the thumb, probably not, but it looks like a mitten. When you pull this off, I like to pull it sideways. And when you do, often you'll release sort of the pressure that keeps liquid inside the claw and will drain out. So we do that over the stock as well. To get the meat out of the claw, I just tap it with the knife to get the knife about a 1/4 inch into the back of the shell, and then twist. And if the shell's a little harder, it'll break right apart. If it's thinner like this, you might just lay it on its side and give it another tap. And that should make it easy to rip apart. Shells right in the stock. And I might have sauteed these along with the shrimp shells as well if my timing was a little different. That would be ideal. So there goes that liquid. Then I check inside the claw. You just give it a little feel around and you'll pull out a piece of cartilage from inside the claw. That may or may not be in there. Give it a little check. If you don't feel it, it's not there. If it's there, you'll know. The knuckles, it's almost like a slingshot, the way it's shaped like a V. If you use the back of the knife and just give it a quick tap, you can then pull it apart. And if you're lucky, you can squeeze the bottom here and pull out the meat. And if you're less lucky, you'll have to use your knife. And again, it's just pressure, a tap, not to crush it, but just to damage it. Then you can kind of peel it apart the way you might get an egg out of a boiled egg out of a shell.
Does this work? We got lobsters and I learned that I'm not very skilled in eating lobster. Does this work for a fully cooked lobster as well?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
The trick, if you'd like to be better skilled at eating lobster, the trick is to just keep putting it in your face and chewing it.
No, I did that. Oh,
then you're an expert. You nailed it. You realize. No, pulling the meat out is kind of a savage operation, and like I said, I did this a lot at a place I worked, and often cut my hands on the shell. It's this is how an animal eats another animal. It's not quite refined. Okay, and let's pretend this is going to be our beautiful stock, because through the magic of Zoom, I have a stock already made. Keeping warm in the oven. We're going to poach a few things. So for the bits and bobs, I have grew some cilantro this summer, and I intentionally let some of it go to seed. And I like to pick the seeds while they're green. They have a very citrusy note, and they're really, really unique. So I might garnish a dish with that. Today I have cilantro seeds that went all the way to dried seed. And that can go right in your stock.
Ganim, someone wants to know why such a small pot. Was that just limited resources?
That's exactly right. Limited resources and poor planning. Do you ever have one of those dreams where you're at work and you're totally unprepared? Some people would call that a nightmare, as I would, and that's happening to me right now with the fire alarms and the small pots. But more on that later.
You're doing great.
All right, now, I guess you can't see this. Stop. Okay. So also in this dish, I have some Maitake mushrooms that a friend and I picked in North Carolina. And it doesn't take much. So because they're wild, they absolutely should be cooked before you consume them. And of course, you would never eat a wild mushroom that you weren't absolutely certain what it was. But even so, it really should be fully cooked. And I've also got some wakame. I meant to go out to Nantucket and pick some, I forget what the actual name is, what people call it, sea beans or sea asparagus. It grows in brackish water. It looks like a succulent, and it has a salty, just this salty green seaweedy kind of a taste. It has a really neat look, but I didn't make it out there today. So here we are with dried wakame.
What is wakame?
So wakame is a Japanese seaweed, and in this case it's dried. You'll see how small this is. When you reconstitute it, it comes out pretty big. I guess that just means seaweed is mostly water. So I'm just going to reconstitute with this hot broth. And when it's ready, we'll plate it up.
Someone wants to know how long you cooked the lobster.
I cooked the lobster I steamed it for about 5 minutes. And it's probably 80% done, maybe 85% done, which I think is perfect for a dish where it's going to be reheated. But some people would steam it for 1 minute, just enough to get the meat that's touching the shell to cook, so that the meat releases from the shell, and you can get what's essentially raw lobster tail or raw lobster meat out of the lobster by just barely cooking the edge of the meat that touches the shell. But in this case, it's not going to be simmered any longer. It's going to go in a very, very hot broth, which will very gently cook the squid, the shrimp, the scallops. It'll finish cooking the lobster, and we'll warm up the clams and the oyster.
Can you use, someone wants to know if you can use any type of mushroom.
Absolutely. I thought about picking up some, there's, even Stop and Shop has bunapi or bunashimeji, which are very small, very mushroomy shaped mushrooms. They're adorable. Enoki mushrooms would be great. But really the idea of this, and you'll see the big reveal. This is not a recipe that's really tied to anything specific. It's just a fun dish. So let's see where we are with this wakame, and I think we can start plating.
Moore's End had some good mushrooms last time I was there.
Moore's End apparently had a mushroom program, I think last year. I stopped in there today. I saw somebody with a t-shirt that said Nantucket Mushrooms. And I asked about it and stopped at Moore's End. And they said they weren't doing it anymore, unfortunately. But they have beautiful stuff there. I love their lettuces. And they've always got like the sunburst and the patty pan squash.
Actually, Mitko, who you met, he makes his own mushrooms, and he did a Yummy Monday on mushrooms, and he grows oyster mushrooms. That's what he taught, but he grows some other ones too.
We have really favorable climate for mushrooms. We find fungus. So I went out to Swam a few weeks ago, and there were a few different types of fungus, but sadly I was not familiar with the ones that we found, so nothing became of them. There's a lot of stuff to pick out here. Okay. So So for the presentation, it's important that most of the ingredients be fairly dry. Not bone dry, just not dripping wet. So that's our, these are the maitakes. Just poached in broth. And the wakame, as you can see, each of those little bits is really blown up.
Wow, it's so big. It's like tea.
A lot like the way tea does, yeah, for sure. I guess. Okay. Now we're going to start building our plate. You can see this. So this bowl was in the oven at 200 degrees. And okay. It's nice and hot. Our broth is very hot as well. So we're going to start assembling. This is the secret ingredient, which is cuttlefish ink, which it's really nice to find them in these little packets because a little goes a long way and it lasts forever. So I'm going to pull a dot of this in the bottom of the plate.
And what is it again?
It's squid ink, cuttlefish ink.
Oh.
So it's, you know, thick and black and one hell of a good time. You know, here's where you kind of put your things together any way you see fit. Shrimp. Tentacles. You know, people have a more artistic eye than I do. Might particularly have fun with this.
Someone asked if this is low calorie.
It's 0 carb, so that's a good thing. But you could certainly, you know, put a little, you know, some noodles in there, or again, anything you like. You know, sweet potatoes would be lovely. More veggies would not go amiss. So, is there too much glare, or can you see what's going on in the bowl?
When you move your hands, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some Maitake mushrooms. And the wakame. Nice little contrast against the red. Now, if I were having someone over and I wanted to at least believe I was dazzling them, the more fun you put in this bowl, and the more beautiful the presentation, the bigger the payoff. So this is shrimp oil. Some of the shrimp that I peeled this year, I put the shells in light olive oil, and it's better to use an oil that has a light taste, because you want to taste the shrimp and not the olive. But as many shells as you can cram into the oil, like a lot of shell, just enough oil to cover. Sometimes I toast the shells and crush them to ensure that, the big volume of shells becomes small and, your flavor is less, therefore it becomes more intense. So in a pot with oil, bring it to a simmer and keep it on the lowest simmer until all the liquid is gone. And once the liquid is gone, I pour it into a jar, put the lid on and close it. So now you have oil that's about 212, 215, 210, whatever it is, with the shells and the lid. As it cools, it will create a vacuum. And because it's essentially sterilized and it's not water, it's oil, so things are sort of devoid of oxygen, it'll preserve. And the color and the flavor of the shrimp shells will leach into the oil. And the longer you let it sit, the better. So a couple of weeks is a good start. And you get this kind of salmon colored oil that is barely perceptible on white, but perceptible nonetheless. I have some cilantro oil. And I'm going to try something I've never tried before, but I've seen it in restaurants. That is bonito flakes, which is, bonito, as you probably know, is a small tuna type fish. And I put them in the 200-degree oven because the package had been opened and I wanted to make sure they were very, very dry. What happens when heat and moisture come close to the bonito, they should kind of dance, or blow in the breeze like a sail or a flag kind of thing. But we'll see what happens today. Also have a shrimp broth that I made earlier this summer, and I'm going to use this one because it's nice and clear and it has the right hue. And when you add it to the soup, what the state it's in now versus the state it becomes in the bowl will be a nice contrast. So if you were to serve this tableside and put this dish in front of somebody with these contrasting colors and textures and shapes, fingers crossed. So hot bowl, hot broth,
Ooh.
Beautiful.
Not as black as it could be.
Hungry.
That's a shame. Well, I guess my suggestion is use more cuttlefish. And the last time I made this, the liquid turned completely black. And to me, the thrill was turning something that, has taken time and is presentable, becomes totally obscured by the black, and then, like a nightmare, you can't see what's going on in the dark. So let's just see what it would look like with more ink.
What, does the ink have a taste? Does it taste like anything?
It tastes like squid. It's really nice. It's commonly used in a dish called, should have made a little practice with this one. It's commonly used in a dish called risotto nero, which means black rice. And it does add, so yeah, I just maybe should have used more ink. It adds a this delicate seafood flavor, the way, you know, fresh squid has sort of a delicate flavor. It's really nice in a lot of things. And it doesn't stain. You can get it on your shirt. That's also scary. But it doesn't seem to stain. And so the shrimp and the tentacles, as the heat hits the proteins contract and they kind of curl up, you know, the way that shrimp curl when they cook. Perhaps if my broth were a little hotter or my bowl were hotter, these would have curled up a bit more, and they tend to, you know, as they sit, they tend to twist into spirals. The tentacles have curled up, which is lovely. And now I've got a hot bowl of soup.
Someone wants to know what, besides sweet potatoes, what other veggies you would add?
Well, personally, I try to avoid starch because I love it so much. So I've recently started using rutabaga instead of noodles. And if you have, let's see if I have one here. This is a Japanese mandolin. And these are about 25 bucks on Amazon. Comes with 3 blades. There's a large blade, medium blade, small blade, fine blade. See the contrast there. With the medium blade, I'll show you with a cucumber what the shape is. But it can be very much like the shape of linguine. You take a rutabaga, you Oh, embarrassing. All right.
You want me to run to Stop and Shop real quick?
Pardon the pause. So, adjust yourself accordingly. And if you, this machine wants nothing more than to eat your fingers, so be very careful. If you get the setting correct, you wind up with something that looks like about the shape of linguine. So rutabaga, because of its texture, its color, and to a certain degree the taste, run it down the mandolin, get yourself a little, you know, a good sized dish, and sprinkle it with salt. Give it a toss.
Can you show us the whole rutabaga so I can see which?
You know, I'm sorry, I don't have a rutabaga. I looked for one this week, and they're not available.
Okay.
But rutabaga looks like a golden turnip, and they're often called purple top rutabagas, if I'm not mistaken. But it's, you know, they can be about, you know, from the size of, say, a tennis ball to the size of a softball, even larger. So they're usually very waxed on the outside. But if you peel them and, you know, cut them into a shape that you can get into this channel, and, you know, very carefully but sure-wristedly, make your little strips.
And do you cook it or do you serve it raw?
Well, I would salt it, and what the salt will do is wilt it, and it will draw a lot of the moisture out of it. Then you could eat it raw, and it would be crunchy. But if you're going to cook it, I would suggest cooking it very, very lightly, so that it doesn't turn into like a cooked squash or a cooked carrot where it would disintegrate or just be, would have no resistance to the bite. So really just once you've got it wilted, just warming it or heating it, so it's the temperature you'd like, tends to get it to be the same consistency you would like if you were trying to fool yourself into thinking you're eating pasta. And this isn't the only shape you could or should do. I've seen people just slice it very, very thin and then cut it with a knife and have these wide, more like fettuccine or tagliatelle kind of shapes. Just tossing them in a little bit of garlic, parsley, and olive oil. Heat up a pan, olive oil, some fresh garlic, not too hot on the pan, just enough to kind of sizzle the garlic a little bit so it's cooked. And add the rutabaga, give it a toss, and you've got something that's a lot like what they call aglio olio, which is olive oil and garlic. And with some chopped parsley and some Parmesan, it's not pasta. It's never going to be pasta. If you want pasta and can't have or shouldn't have or don't want to indulge yourself in pasta, it's a really close facsimile.
Sounds amazing. The whole thing looks great.
Thank you.
See, does anyone have any questions or anything for Ganim? Do you have to-go containers? Well, all right, here's a question, actually. That is a big portion. How long does it last, or how would you save it? Like, what do you do with it when you're done having the portion you're eating?
Well, I think I would plan to make this for more than one person. So if, say, 2 people were splitting a lobster and you had, 1 lobster, 2 shrimp, 2 clams, 2 oysters, that winds up being about the same protein you would get out of 1 lobster. So I think just sort of adding the right amount of protein would be what you would want to do. And this is a very wide bowl. It's not very deep. So it looks very large, but it's a very shallow bowl. And of course, you could prepare several bowls in advance, keep them warm in the oven for a short amount of time. Especially if you cover the bowls so they don't dry out. Then you could just pour broth in each bowl and feed a crowd.
Someone asked, would this be good with crusty bread?
Well, what isn't good with crusty bread? I think it would. This particular cast of flavors might lend itself more to some rice or noodles, but I mean, bread soaked in broth is divine.
Let's see. Oh, and someone, once again, how long did you cook the lobster for suggested consistency? You steamed them for 5 minutes, was that?
I steamed it for 5 minutes. So the ratio that people kind of stick by is 5 minutes per pound when poaching a lobster. And I do that about the same for steaming a lobster. Because this lobster weighed more than a pound, doing it for 5 minutes got it to the point where it was not completely cooked, but it was cooked to the point where I hoped it would be.
Did you put anything else in the water, or you just added water and dropped it in?
Just water.
Okay.
I've never poached any lobster or anything besides just water. I think people will poach lobsters in drawn butter, which is really decadent and really neat. And then use the butter over and over again until you get the butter to a point where it's, it tastes more like lobster than butter. And then you use that butter for something else. You could use that butter for mashed potatoes or spread it on crusty bread.
Or mac and cheese.
Mac and cheese, yeah. Options are endless at that point.
JM says, yes, absolutely divine. Good. Anyone else? Any other questions for Ganim? Don't see any. Do you have anything to add?
I don't, except to say maybe don't skimp on the squid ink. If you're going to try this. And, you know, I think this is more of a concept than a recipe. So have fun.
Yeah, good. Lyd says, I toss in onions, carrots, and white wine, pepper, and corn. Or peppercorn. I don't know. Either. Both.
Peppercorn.
Yeah,
Peppercorns.
I mean, a lobster bake, sure. That's, you know, that's kind of a thing, an American standard. Lobsters, potatoes, corn, clams, all in one pot. It's also really lovely.
Thank you. This is great. Can you send us the recipe? Can you email us the recipe?
I can email you a description. Yes.
Okay.
I don't have a specific recipe, but I can email a description as sort of method of preparation and how to achieve the same thing out of what's hiding in your fridge. I was just gonna say I was at a beach party a few years ago, and a chef friend of mine, they had a bonfire. They dug a pit in the sand, then they shoved rocks from the fire and some of the sort of cinders and, you know, charcoal from the fire into the pit, threw seaweed on it, then put lobsters on top of that. And I think they just used wet towels that they had dipped in the ocean to cover the lobsters. And I don't know how long it cooked for, but probably you would have to gauge with how hot your stones are versus, you know, how big your lobsters are, et cetera, et cetera. But the smokiness from the cinders and the, I don't know if it's chlorophyll, but the green flavor from the seaweed got right into the lobster. It was really neat. It was really good. So if you have some ashes and seaweed in your kitchen, throw them in the pot too.
So we did record this. So what I can do is everyone that signed up tonight, I can email you the link. And Ganim, if you don't mind typing up real quick, a recipe that or a concept that I could send out to people, I'm sure they'd appreciate that.
I don't mind at all.
Cool.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And stay tuned. We have another one coming up at the end of the month. Amy is going to be doing salt, just all things salt. So tune in for that. Thanks so much, Ganim. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.